The chamber of the orbital summit hung above a blue-white star, a cathedral of glass and gravity where thousands of species watched themselves pretend at peace. At the center stood the banner of the Astrix Coalition, a symbol meant to promise balance between predators and prey. Delegations filled tiered platforms, armored giants beside fragile diplomats, all under the unblinking glow of recording drones broadcasting to entire civilizations. Humanity's presence was small by comparison: one modest delegation, a handful of officials, and a single uniformed guard positioned behind them in quiet stillness. The guard belonged to the United States Marine Corps. No exoskeleton, no ceremonial blade, no visible weapon beyond discipline and posture. His dress blues were simple among the galaxy's excess, but he stood like a fixed point in space, eyes forward, hands locked behind his back. The galaxy had already decided what that meant. Humans were new, persistent, clever, soft. Survivors of a violent world, yes, but still a young species playing among ancient killers. Across the floor, the delegation of the Korath Dominion waited in towering armor grown from living metal. Their lead warrior stepped forward, heavy footfalls echoing through the chamber. His species had shattered empires long before humanity lit its first rocket. His combat honors glowed across his chest in bioluminescent sigils. He spoke without requesting the floor, his voice tearing through translation fields like grinding stone. He ridiculed Earth's defenses. He mocked human fleets as drifting scrap. He called their survival an accident of being too insignificant to kill earlier. The chamber shifted with nervous energy. Insults between apex species carried ritual meaning. Among the Korath, dominance was never symbolic. It was physical. The warrior crossed the distance to the human platform alone. Astrix guards tensed but did not interfere. By Korath law, a challenge delivered in person was sacred. The Korath leaned close to the Marine, towering over him, breath hot with chemical heat. Cameras pushed closer. Millions of viewers leaned in across the galaxy, anticipating a public lesson in hierarchy. The slap sounded like a small thunderclap. The Marine's head snapped sideways. A thin line of blood traced from his lip to the polished floor. The Korath warrior turned his back instantly, already dismissing the human as beneath further notice. Laughter rippled through several predator delegations. Commentators began labeling the moment as the humbling of Terra. Analysts prepared predictions of humanity's political collapse within cycles. The Marine did not fall. For 2 full seconds, nothing moved. Then he straightened. Slowly. Deliberately. The chamber quieted without instruction. The laughter died first, followed by the network chatter. Something in the way he lifted his head disturbed instincts older than diplomacy. He did not touch his wound. He did not look at his own delegation. His eyes followed only one thing: the towering armored back of the warrior who had struck him. He spoke one short sentence. It was not a threat. It was not shouted. Translation systems hesitated as if unsure the words were meant for public broadcast. "You've made a mistake." The Korath turned, amused. All around them, ancient races leaned back, prepared to witness a swift execution. The human stepped forward once. No stance. No flourish. Just movement. The final second stretched thin enough for entire civilizations to realize, too late, that they had misunderstood what they were watching. Every rule they believed had been broken already. He stepped forward before the echo of the slap finished fading from the chamber. No roar came from him, no tightening of posture that aliens associated with attack instinct. His movement was economical, terrifyingly calm, as if the violence had already been decided elsewhere and simply required execution. The Korath warrior laughed, a grinding hiss of amusement, and lifted one armored hand to strike again for spectacle. The hand never completed the arc. The Marine's fist moved first, too fast for most optical systems to track, a single compressed line of force traveling upward. Impact sounded wrong. Not a crack, not a thud, but a wet structural collapse transmitted through the warrior's skull. Armor split at the jawline. Bone failed under pressure never meant for biological matter. The towering body froze upright for half a second, then folded inward as the head caved. The corpse struck the floor and pieces of armor and silence. Medical glyphs exploded across the broadcast, translating in horrified real time. Cause of death was listed twice, then updated again when systems recalculated the physics. Cranial integrity 0. Brain trauma, absolute. Survival probability, none. No one moved. Delegates that had survived planetary annihilation sat paralyzed, caught between instinct to flee and disbelief that what they had seen was possible. The Marine did not pursue, did not posture over the body. He simply stood where he had struck, breath steady, knuckles darkening. Recognition rolled through data networks like a shockwave. The fallen belonged to the Korath, blood exalted, warriors bred and reinforced to kill titans on high-gravity worlds. Their bones alone were rated stronger than most battle armors. One had just been ended by an unaugmented human. Uproars shredded the chamber. Predator species erupted in furious signals. Prey delegations collapsed into terrified stillness. Automated defenses locked onto the Marine from 100 angles and then hesitated, command chains stalling under conflicting treaty protocols. The broadcast surged to record-breaking transmission density as the galaxy demanded explanations. Security forces surged at last, surrounding the Marine in layered fields and kinetic barriers. He did not resist. His gaze never left the wreck at his feet. Orders came to seize him as a diplomatic offering, a symbolic surrender meant to contain what had just happened before it escalated beyond control. The human delegation's response arrived less than a second later, routed through channels that bypassed every request filter. Their message was brief, unambiguous, and carried no legal framing. The Marine was not property to be surrendered. Any attempt to take him would be understood as an act of war. Shock rippled again, even deeper now. The idea that a new species would answer the killing of an apex champion with a threat instead of an apology rearranged ancient assumptions. Military analysts across thousands of systems began running projections that all ended the same way. Humanity could not be contained by precedent. The Marine finally glanced toward his own delegation. There was no fear in their posture, only a quiet, fatal confidence that unsettled even hardened warlords. Medics requested permission to retrieve the Korath remains. No one answered. The image of the shattered skull had already burned into the collective memory of space. Sensors across the station detected human fleet traffic reclassifying from patrol displacement to synchronized strategic movement. The shift was subtle, invisible to civilian interpretation, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever commanded war. What had begun as a humiliation had transitioned into a countdown without ceremony. In less than 3 seconds, a ritual meant to assert dominance had erased a legend and exposed an era the galaxy could not undo. The silence that followed was no longer disbelief. It was calculation. Somewhere far beyond the glass and banners, humanity had already begun to answer the slap. Data tides detonated across inhabited space within minutes. Analysts ripped through archived human conflicts once dismissed as primitive brutality, and reassembled them with fresh parameters. Survival projections plummeted as casualty scales were reinterpreted. The galaxy had mistaken frequency for recklessness, attrition for incompetence. What it was watching now was efficiency shaped by centuries of extinction-level pressure. Identification files on the Marine tore free of classification locks that were never meant to fail. His service record did not read like a biography but a sequence of collapsed strongholds, terminated insurgencies, and erased enemy command structures. He was not celebrated. He was utilized. He had been engineered by doctrine rather than genetics, sharpened by doctrine rather than ritual. The dead warrior's history finished compiling moments later. He had crushed armored megafauna with his bare claws. He had split city shields rated against orbital bombardment. Every victory had been public, ceremonial, layered with intimidation. The Marine's record contained no ceremony at all. Only outcomes. Only endings. Across the Astrix networks, behavioral models crashed. There was no cultural codec to explain a species that trained for annihilation without spectacle. The Marine had not asserted dominance. He had corrected an error. That distinction terrified every strategist who understood it. Symbols could be negotiated. Corrections could not. Mobilization signatures flared from human space, as if the slap had toggled a buried switch. Long idle fleets realigned from patrol geometry into strike formations so refined they resembled mathematical proofs. The first confirmed hull transponder identified a Titan-class dreadnought translating into deep-range attack posture without fanfare, without broadcast, without threat declaration. The Korath response arrived wrapped in tradition and rage. Their envoy declared blood debt before 1,000 world witnesses. Surrender of the Marine was demanded as tribute. The demand carried legal weight under ancient war compacts, and the threat carried credibility under ancient kill charts. Conventional powers began evacuating diplomatic assets preemptively. Human command answered through a channel that did not seek majority recognition. The signature authentication matched the highest authority of the human fleet command. The reply contained no rhetoric. It stated that the Marine remained on duty and that any force entering human custody zones would be treated as hostile without further notice. That single sentence severed 27 standing precedents. Defense consortiums collapsed their neutrality clauses. Mercenary leagues canceled contracts mid-transit. Insurance syndicates froze war risk ledgers to prevent mathematical bankruptcy. None of it slowed the convergence that had already begun. The Marine was returned to human control without struggle. No cuffs touched him. No field disrupted his stride. A strict security receded as if stepping away from an exposed reactor. Behind him, technicians finished collecting what remained of the fallen warrior, sealing fragments into biosarcophagi that weighed more than lightweight cruisers. For the first time in recorded interstellar history, the Korath High War Council issued a formal total war mobilization order against a single individual's home species. Planetary forges ignited. Ancestral assault beasts were thawed from preservational vaults. Star gods long kept dormant beneath living moons were stirred with electromagnetic hymns. Human fleets did not mirror the spectacle. They did not amplify transmissions. They did not invoke heritage. They simply repositioned with silent synchronization that no coalition algorithm could intercept. Every movement suggested anticipation rather than reaction. The implication unnerved commanders who had spent millennia forcing enemies to answer on their terms. Children on distant worlds would later learn that the conflict began here, not with a formal declaration, not with a first volley, but with the sudden realization that humanity had never been posturing for survival. It had been preparing for inevitability. The slap had not provoked war. It had merely revealed the time frame. By the time the galaxy understood that the Marine was not an exception but a representative output of a larger design, the countdown to irreversible engagement had already crossed the point where caution could intervene. The role of witness had ended. Calculation had replaced disbelief. And calculation said the same thing to every power that dared to run it. The first strikes landed before most commanders accepted the war state. Navigation beacons failed in synchronized cascades, star fortresses lost targeting coherence, and entire Korath flotillas drifted blind while human fire threaded through gaps that had not existed a heartbeat earlier. Command relays attempted manual recovery and vanished under precision kinetic lances. 8 minutes defined the lifetime of the Korath war machine. The opening cyberwave erased doctrine libraries and spoofed friend or foe tables, causing autonomous batteries to reap their own screens in defensive panic. While they struggled to reassert control, mass drivers stitched vacuum into bladed corridors through carrier lines. Boarding vectors followed immediately, human pods riding the shock fronts like parasites of momentum. Compartment after compartment went dark as Marines advanced without broadcast, without warning, without any pause long enough for terror to stabilize. Resistance formed sporadically and died locally, efficient pockets collapsing faster than distress codes could propagate. Planetary shields that had endured stellar flares failed under harmonic bombardment tuned to their own resonance. Cities vanished in layered silence as evacuation corridors folded into gravity wells seeded minutes earlier. The defenders never saw the second wave because the first removed the concept of rearward space behind them. The Marine who had been struck entered the war where resistance densest. He did not lead speeches or coordinates. His presence was confirmation that objectives designated impossible had become mandatory. 3 fortified command knots fell within his advance path, each taken by converging entries timed to a shared final second. Korath counteroffensives detached in rage and met emptiness where targets had already been culled. Their greatest surviving armada broke and attempted retreat through a corridor humanity had prepared as an absorption net. All exits were illusions mapped as invitations to collision geometries that crushed ships inward like closed fists snapping. Capitals broadcast surrender codes that were overwritten by older permissions the Korath had once forced on lesser races. The mechanism they had called law returned as process, cold and recursive. The war did not slow, it compressed, every remaining defense folding into a smaller and faster calculation of loss. By the 5th minute, production worlds were silent ruins and relay stars no longer answered. Ancient war beasts emerged only to be drowned under directed stellar shear that stripped them to luminous skeletons. Their handlers transmitted extinction rites in languages that had not known prayer for 1,000 years before. The 8th minute arrived without ceremony. The last coherent fleet element attempted a ramming sequence against the Marines' spearhead group and was flensed apart by layered interception before contact geometry existed. Wreckage vectors painted the void in slow cinders that outpaced their own debris shadows by deliberate design choices embedded. When coalition envoys finally cut through with ceasefire demands, there was no coordinating hub left to receive compliance. The Korath civilization had been reduced to a series of disconnected aftermaths. The war had not ended, it had completed, execution concluding before the language of mercy arrived in usable form anywhere. The Marine stood on a shattered command deck coated in cooling biometal and drifting ash. He gave no report beyond confirmation tones and a single request for extraction routing. Around him, surviving enemies abandoned weapons whose firing permissions had been invalidated by the collapse of their own authorities seconds earlier. The galaxy processed the outcome after the fact, as it always did with outcomes that allowed no alternative branches. 8 minutes rewrote centuries of intimidation economics, nullified bloodline armories, and erased the predator myth that had governed expansion patterns since before humans recorded time. Survivors transmitted the final image that would define the era, a lone human figure walking through debris fields made from something the universe had once feared. By the time historians argued methodology, authority, or morality, the map itself had already changed, star by star, border by border, without referendum, without pause, without any surviving power object. The directive that followed the collapse traveled faster than any fleet ever could. It did not call itself a treaty. It did not claim moral authority. It simply redefined what consequences meant. Across every surviving archive, the moment of the slap and the 8 minutes that followed were indexed under a new historical classification, 3-second extinction protocol. Not as a warning. As a reference standard for absolute response. Systems that had never spoken to humanity before began transmitting compliance notices without being asked. Border fortresses powered down weapon lattices and locked them into manual-only states. Species that had lived under shadow empires quietly discovered that their overlords no longer answered. Predators recalculated food chain assumptions that had been stable for geological eras. Prey learned, not with hope but with awe, that fear could be displaced. Where the Astrix hierarchy had once synchronized policy through compromise and intimidation, a vacuum now existed. Into it formed a new alignment without banners or rotating chairs, provisionally designated by analysts as the human security mandate. Its purpose was not to govern. It was to terminate escalation before it matured into threat architecture. Human fleets did not stage victory formations. They dispersed into quiet coverage patterns that rendered ambush obsolete. The galaxy realized too late that conquest had not been the objective. Containment had. The map no longer reflected who ruled whom. It reflected who could not be challenged again. The Marine returned to duty on a frontier station whose name barely registered on star charts. No honors were issued. No broadcasts were requested. His medical file recorded superficial injury to the cheek, fully resolved. The same record noted 0 dislocations, 0 stress fractures, 0 neural trauma from the engagement that had ended a civilization. His commanding officer acknowledged receipt and reassigned him to routine perimeter watch. Children on distant worlds would later learn the sequence in neutral phrasing: insult, correction, annihilation, stabilization. They would ask why the human had not been punished. Their instructors would answer with quiet certainty that punishment implied mutual jurisdiction, and nothing equal had remained after 8 minutes. The law that emerged was not voted on. It was inferred. It existed in the sudden disappearance of ritual humiliation from diplomatic practice. It existed in how no species ever again tested contact through physical dominance when humans were present. It existed in the way military academies removed chapters on ceremonial intimidation and replaced them with sterile case studies marked simply, "Do not trigger." Private networks whispered a simpler version: "Never strike a human. Not one. Not ever." Years later, explorers would uncover abandoned Korath-forged worlds where production lines had halted mid-motion, cooling in layered silence. They would find assault beasts fused into landing bays that never opened. They would log these discoveries as evidence of sudden extinction. None of their reports would capture the real cause. The cause had not been the weapons. It had been timing. The galaxy had learned that humanity did not escalate in steps. It transitioned from presence to outcome without staging points in between. Negotiation had been rendered optional not through tyranny, but through certainty. Every species understood what came next if that certainty was challenged, and certainty proved far more persuasive than terror ever had. The Marine never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked in classified debrief what he had felt at the moment his fist moved, the response recorded was a single line stripped of explanation. Task recognized. Action executed. The universe adjusted itself around that philosophy. Borders hardened where they needed to and softened where they could. Wars grew shorter then rarer. Not because violence had vanished, but because the upper boundary of consequence now had a clear, horrific definition no strategist dared to sample again. Long after the banners of the old order faded into museum projections and the last survivors of fallen powers died out in obscurity, one fact endured across every chart, every academy, every unspoken assumption governing interaction between stars. Humanity was not the loudest force in the galaxy. It was the final one.